The London system is a very popular opening for white. Lots of players opt for this opening as it's a relatively simple system and one doesn't need to memorize a lot of different variations. It's also a very solid system, and if black doesn't know how to play against it, he can easily get in trouble and lose very fast. In the game I'm gonna show you, Akiba Rubinstein destroys the London system in a spectacular way, creating a strategic and tactical masterpiece. Rubinstein's opponent, Frank Marshall, starts with d4, Rubinstein plays d5 and bishop f4. The London system. White is going to play e3, c3, reinforcing his central pawn, knight f3, knight d2 and bishop d3. All these moves constitute the London system. Knight f6 followed, knight f3, e6, e3 and Rubinstein plays c5, attacking white's central pawn and opening his queen's diagonal. c3 followed, Marshall reinforces his central pawn, and of course now that white has developed his dark squared bishop and the bishop isn't on c1 and it isn't defending the b2 pawn, black can immediately attack it by playing queen b6. But in this position it wouldn't give black any advantage, because in this case white can simply play queen b3 defending his pawn, and in case black exchanges, of course that would be in white's favor as white would get the half-open file for his rook. So instead of queen b6, Rubinstein develops his knight, knight c6, and Marshall plays bishop d3. And now we can see white's idea in the London system. He's going to play knight d2, after which he will get the full control over the e4 square, preventing the black knight from jumping there, and also white gets the control over the e5 square. So both of these central squares will be under white's control. White is going to centralize his knight. The knight will jump from f3 to e5, after which white might think about the attack on the king side by rerouting his queen to the king side via f3. Later the queen can move to h3 and attack together with the light squared bishop the h7 square. Of course, by that time the black king will castle. However, the sequence of the moves is also very important, and in this position, instead of bishop d3, which was played by Marshall, it would have been better to play knight d2 first, and only then bishop d3, because in this case, in this position, if black plays queen b6, attacking the b2 pawn, now that the knight has vacated the b1 square, white could have played rook b1 in this position. But after bishop d3, it isn't the case. Of course, in this position, black could have played bishop d6, which would be a standard move in the London system, so the black bishop challenges the white's dark squared bishop and black starts to fight for the crucial e5 square. But in our game, instead of bishop d6, Rubinstein plays queen b6, attacking the b2 pawn. And it turns out that although white has a lot of different options to defend this pawn, all of these options have their drawbacks. For example, in case white plays queen b3, which worked very well a move before, now it would be a mistake. Now that white has developed his bishop to d3, black can play c4 with a double attack, and the only move white has is queen takes b6. White is forced to do it, and after that it would be black who would open his a file and exert pressure. Besides that, black would get a chance to start the active play on the queen side by moving his b pawn. What else can white do to defend his pawn? Another move that comes to mind is b3, of course. But in the London system, white wants to retain his pyramid of pawns so that the pawns defend each other. In case white plays b3, his c3 pawn would be weakened, and after black captures on d4 later in the game, and white usually recaptures with the e pawn, not the c pawn, because if white captures with the c pawn, the c file would open and black would get the counterplay on this file. So after white recaptures on d4 with his e pawn, the c3 pawn wouldn't be defended by the b2 pawn anymore, and black rook will exert pressure on the weakened pawn on c3. Besides that, the queen can attack it from a5. What else can white do? Of course, queen d2 doesn't make any sense, because on the d2 the queen would have occupied the knight square, so the d2 square belongs to the knight. And the last move that comes to mind is queen c2, which also has its drawback. Black is going to play bishop d7 followed by rook c8, creating an X-ray on the c file, and black would threaten to capture on d4, and after e takes d, black would play knight b4, with the fork attacking the queen and the bishop. And of course, white pawn on c3 won't be able to capture the b4 knight because of the pin, because the pawn on c3 would be pinned. The rook from c8 would attack the c2 queen. For this reason, instead of queen c2, Marshall plays queen c1, so that after bishop d7 and rook c8, the knight b4, possible knight b4, wouldn't attack his queen. But queen c1 also has its drawback. Namely, the queen is much better placed on d1, because white is planning to play knight e5 followed by queen f3 and queen h3, so the queen must take part in the attack of the king side together with the bishop and the other minor pieces. Besides that, from d1 the queen controls the h5 square, preventing the black knight from jumping there. And now that the queen is on c1, the only thing it does is to defend the b2 pawn, so the queen is passively placed on c1. Rubinstein, before developing his king side, develops the queen side, because he wants to play rook c8 as soon as possible to create the X-ray on the c file. Marshall castles king side, rook c8 followed, knight d2, bishop e7, and now ideally white wants to play knight e5 in the London system. That's the standard move. But in case white plays knight e5 right away, black would simply exchange, and after d takes e, his knight can jump on h5, as the white queen isn't on d1 and it doesn't control this square. And this will lead to the exchange of the important dark squared bishop. That's why before playing knight e5, white queen must return to d1 and take control over the h5 square, but right now the queen cannot move away from c1 as the b2 pawn would fall. That's why Marshall first defends his pawn with the rook b1, and he's going to play queen d1 followed by knight e5 next move. Rubinstein castles king side, queen d1 follows. Now white is ready to play knight e5, rook d8, knight e5, knight takes e5, d takes e, and now that the white queen controls the h5 square, the knight must retreat to a passive square e8. And queen h5, threatening checkmate in 1. That's why Rubinstein plays f5, closing the bishop's diagonal and preventing the checkmate. So now this pawn on e5 is very strong. It restricts black, so it exerts very unpleasant pressure. The black knight is very passive, it cannot move to f6 or d6 because of this pawn. For this reason, Marshall didn't capture en passant. However, he had to do it. He had to agree to exchange his strong pawn, and he had to agree to the activization of the knight. Knight takes f6 with a tempo attacking the queen. Now that the bishop's diagonal is open, but knight defends the h7 too, the white queen will be forced to retreat, and this position would be more or less equal. But instead of this, it seems that Marshall didn't feel like giving up his strong pawn, and he made a different move. In order to understand the idea behind his next move, it's important to know what the black is going to do. One of black's main problems is his light squared bishop, which is a bad bishop. It's restricted by its own pawns on the light squares, so black wants to exchange this bishop by playing bishop b5, after which the exchange will take place. Black will exchange his bad bishop for white's good bishop, because the white's bishop, won't be able to retreat after this, as his f1 rook would fall. That's why Marshall plays rook e1, moving away his rook from f1. And after bishop b5, now he can retreat his bishop to c2. Now Rubinstein starts his sophisticated queen maneuvers. First he plays queen a6, attacking the a2 pawn, which is now unguarded, and creating the bishop and queen battery, creating another threat, namely bishop d3, which again would lead to the exchange of the bishops, because the white bishop won't be able to retreat as his b1 rook would fall under attack this time. That's why Marshall plays rook a1, defending his pawn, and after bishop d3, now the bishop can retreat. However, it would be better for white to finally agree to the exchange of the bishops, because the black bishop is a very strong piece now. It isn't the passive bad bishop it used to be on d7. So white had to exchange, after which again the position would be more or less equal. However, Marshall was still thinking about the attack on the king side, and for the attack he needed his bishop. So he played bishop d1. So he insists upon avoiding the exchange, but his bishop now is quite passive, while black bishop is very strong and it controls the b1 square, preventing the rook from moving there. And that's why Rubinstein returns his queen to b6 now, attacking the pawn. And it isn't clear how white is going to avoid the material loss, because it seems that the only way to defend the pawn is b3, but in this case the c3 pawn would be weakened again, and black can immediately attack it by playing queen a5, and there is no way white can save the pawn. For example, if rook c1 defending the c3 pawn, the a2 pawn would fall in this case. But Marshall was a very creative player, and he found a very interesting idea. He plays knight b3, offering the sacrifice of a pawn. Of course, Rubinstein can immediately win a pawn by kicking out the knight, by playing c4, which he didn't do, because the c4 move has a very serious drawback. After c4, the d4 square is weakened, and that was Marshall's idea. For a sacrificed pawn, he would have got a very strong centralized knight. The knight would occupy a great blockading square. Black, of course, can win a pawn, but the knight would be very strong. It would attack black's main weakness on e6, and white would definitely get a very good compensation for a pawn. So, instead of c4, Rubinstein makes a much stronger move. a5. He's going to kick the knight out of b3 with his a pawn, so that the knight cannot jump to d4. And after a4, the knight will have to return to d2 or to c1, after which the b2 pawn would fall. Marshall plays bishop f3. Now, of course, black could have played a4 right away, but in this case the knight would have retreated to c1 and attack the bishop, so black wouldn't have time to capture on b2 as his bishop would be under attack. That's why before moving the a pawn to a4, Rubinstein moves away his bishop from d3. And now he is threatening to play a4, and after the knight retreats, the b2 pawn would fall. That's why Marshall plays rook e2, defending his pawn. Rubinstein moves his knight to c7, rook d2 followed, and only now, finally, Rubinstein moves his a pawn, a4, and the knight retreats to c1. So white has managed to defend his pawn, but at a very high price. His pieces are terribly placed. His knight is terribly placed. His rook isn't developed, and it isn't clear how it's going to be developed. The second rook is passively placed. It isn't clear what it's doing. The bishop is bad. It's limited by its own pawn. The bishop on f3 isn't doing much. So, while the black pieces are quite strong, especially the light-squared bishop is centralized, and black is dominating the center. As you see, the f5, d5, and c5 pawns control all important central squares. So black is dominating the center and also the queen side. So white is already squeezed in the center and on the queen side. And it seems that the most logical plan for black, the most logical way to continue to exert more pressure is, of course, to start thinking about the breakthrough in the center by playing d4, which was possible, of course. After that, black would have increased his advantage. Or maybe even a3, which was also possible, after which the b2 pawn would have disappeared, and the c3 pawn would have become weak again, and black could have attacked it by playing knight b5, for example. So all this would be in black's favor, of course, but Rubinstein plays more sophisticated chess. So before breaking through in the center, and he isn't in a hurry, he can break through later in the game. So before doing it, he wants to get the space advantage and the domination on the king side too. And he starts playing on the king side, first g6, kicking out the queen moves to h3, and the only way, of course, to get the domination on the king side is to play g5. But right away it doesn't work. In this case, after g5, at first sight it's possible because black bishop defends the g5 pawn, but white could have captured on g5, and after bishop takes g5 it turns out that white can pin the bishop. And black can defend it, but still h4 would follow, the bishop would fall, and black's king side would be demolished, and white, of course, could have tried to create some threats on the king side. That's why before playing g5, Rubinstein makes a preparation move, king h8, a very strong move. And now there is no way white can prevent g5. Marshall tried to prevent it. He played queen h6, taking under control the g5 square. But Rubinstein exchanges on f3 and opens the g file. Now that the pawn has disappeared from g2, black can play g5. And it turns out that, of course, white cannot capture on g5. That would be a blunder, because after queen takes g5, rook g8, the queen is pinned and white is losing it. So after g5, the bishop is forced to retreat to g3. So the mission is complete. Now Rubinstein dominates the whole board, the center, the queen side, and the king side. That means now it's time to break through. So white pieces are completely cramped, squeezed. They are placed on the third rank. They are very passive. The only queen cannot create any threats on the king side. So d4, creating an immediate threat to capture either on e3 or c3, it doesn't really matter, after which the d file would open, the rook would fall under attack, so white would be forced to exchange on d8, after which the black rook would recapture, of course, and the black rook would invade. And also the b2 pawn would fall, because the only defender of this pawn would disappear, and the black queen would simply capture on b2. So white's position looks hopeless. But Marshall was a very creative player, and again he finds a very interesting possibility. So he sacrifices a piece a bishop for two pawns and the activity by capturing on d4. So the pawn has left the e3 square, it doesn't control the f4 square anymore, and that means black can play f4, which Rubinstein did, and the bishop is trapped. But now we can see Marshall's idea. Of course, he didn't capture on f4 twice. In this case, after g takes f, queen takes f4, black can play bishop g5, attacking the queen. If the queen retreats, the rook would fall, and of course white cannot capture the bishop for the same reason, the queen would be pinned. But now we can see Marshall's idea. He plays knight e2, activating his knight, and now threatening to capture on f4, because the knight is also attacking f4. That's why Rubinstein captures on g3, and now we can see his idea, Marshall's idea. He gets the second pawn for the piece by capturing h takes g, and opens the h file. So besides two pawns, he also gets a chance to create some attack on the king side. He's going to play king g2, opening way for his rook, after which he will threaten checkmate. And it looks quite dangerous, because the black pieces are placed on the queen side, and it wouldn't be so easy to reroute them to the king side to defend it. But Rubinstein finds a way of doing it. He plays queen c6, a strong move with a tempo, attacking the pawn. He's going to reroute his queen to g6, so that it defends the h7 pawn. And it turns out that white cannot play king g2, which looks like the most natural move, defending the pawn, opening way for the rook, because black can play g4, attacking the pinned pawn for the second time. That's why Marshall plays queen h5, defending the pawn with his queen and preventing the black pawn from moving to g4. Rubinstein plays rook f8, attacking the f3 pawn for the second time, and only now Marshall plays king g2. Now that the black pawn cannot move forward, he defends his pawn and opens way for his rook to h1. So rook h1 would be deadly. After that, white would threaten checkmate. That's why queen e8, offering the exchange of the queens, which would be, of course, in black's favor, as black is up a piece. So, of course, Marshall avoids the exchange. Queen g4 followed, and queen g6. Rook h1 followed, and now that the black queen is defending the e6 pawn, the knight isn't forced to defend it anymore. And the ideal square for the passive knight would have been d5. But in this case, white can kick the knight out by playing c4. So Rubinstein makes a strong positional move by playing c4 himself, blockading the c3 pawn, now it cannot move forward, and ensuring a great blockading square for his knight. So the knight will dominate the center of the board on d5. Again, white's position looks completely hopeless, but again, creative Marshall finds a very interesting chance. He plays queen e4, creating two threats. First, queen takes g6, winning the queen. Of course, black cannot recapture as his h-pawn is pinned. And the second is to capture on b7. And it turns out that in case black exchanges on e4, that would be in white's favor. He would have captured on e4, and suddenly he would have got very strong central pawns and very good counterplay in the center. His e-pawn controls the d5 square. Now the knight cannot jump to d5 anymore, and after moving from f3, the f2 pawn's way is open and it can move forward. The d pawn can move forward, creating a threat of d6 with a fork. So white would get protected passed pawn. So that would have given white a very good counterplay. So capturing on g6 or on e4 would be a mistake. So black must do something, because white has created two threats. Queen takes g6 and queen takes b7. And you can pause the video now and find Rubinstein's great idea. How to solve this problem, how to parry both of these threats. So Rubinstein sacrifices the b7 pawn. He plays king g7. Now, of course, if white captures on g6, the black king will recapture. That would be in black's favor. So Marshall accepts the sacrifice, getting the third pawn for a sacrificed piece. So, which is the sufficient equivalent, of course. But now we can see Rubinstein's idea. Knight d5, not only getting a great centralized knight, but also this knight cuts off the queen from the king side. The queen cannot return to the king side to take part in its defense. And on the queen side, the queen isn't doing anything. The only thing it does is attacking and pinning the bishop, but the knight is defending it. So the queen is absolutely out of play. And as the queen cannot take part in the defense of the king side, that means it's time to start the attack on the white king. And black is threatening to play g4 right away, demolishing white's king side. After that, it doesn't matter if white captures on g4 or moves his pawn forward to f4, the pawn would disappear from f3, and that means the black queen would invade e4, invade the king side, and that would be deadly. That's why Marshall prevents it by playing g4 himself. And of course, now black has a very big advantage. The white queen is out of play, the white pieces aren't doing anything, the knight is terribly placed, it doesn't have any squares to move. So white's position is terrible. And just by playing rook c7, kicking out the queen, followed by queen f7, exerting pressure on the f file, threatening to capture on f3, and after rook h3, playing h5, threatening h takes g. After f takes g, of course, the f2 pawn would fall. Black could have got a winning position. Of course, if white captures with the rook, then the f3 pawn falls. If white captures with the pawn on h5, then g4 is possible, demolishing white's king side. But it seems that Rubinstein wanted to finish his strategic masterpiece with a brilliant sacrifice by playing romantically. So he sacrifices a rook. Rook takes f3. And now white can capture either the f3 rook or the c8 rook. Marshall captured on c8, which turned out to be a mistake. He actually could have tried to continue the resistance by capturing on f3, which looks very dangerous because the second rook would replace the first one on f8 with a check. But it turns out that white could have tried to defend. Of course, king g3 is losing because of queen e4 attacking the bishop, the rook threatening queen f3 check, followed by queen takes f2 check. So the move that makes sense is rook f1 defending the pawn, but it doesn't help. Rook f3 check would follow, queen takes g4, threatening checkmate on h3, knight g3 looks like the only move, but h5 threatening h4. White doesn't have any counterplay. There is nothing white can do to prevent h4, and white's position, of course, collapses on the king side. But instead of king g3 in this position, white could have played king g2. And in this case, after queen e4 check, king g1, queen takes g4 check, knight g3, rook f3. Black, of course, creates many threats, so rook d3 is a threat, attacking the rook, and if white exchanges, black would get a very strong passed pawn on d3. Besides that, black is threatening a3, and after the disappearance of the b2 pawn, the c3 pawn would fall. Of course, black can capture it with the rook or the knight. White can try, however, playing a3, preventing black from moving his pawn, but h5 was possible. Now black is threatening h4, but it turns out that white can play rook takes h5. The rook is defended by the knight. Black can eliminate the defender and capture the rook, and it seems that black is much better because he has two pieces for the rook. His knight is great, his queen is very active, white queen is out of play, white king is in trouble, the g3 pawn is weakened, but the computer actually shows the equality. So by playing precisely, which of course would be almost impossible in the practical game, white could have held this position. But all this was very difficult, of course, and instead of capturing on f3 in our game, Marshall captures on c8, but now his position collapses. Queen e4, the queen invades. Black is threatening the deadly discovered check by moving his rook with a check. So Marshall plays king g1. Now another strong move by Rubinstein, knight e3, creating a threat of checkmate in two moves by rook g3, check, opening the queen's diagonal with a tempo. The knight also controls the g2 square. So after rook g3 check, no matter what white does, queen g2 checkmate would follow. And of course, white cannot capture the knight. In this case, the pawn would disappear from f2 and queen takes g4 check would follow. So there is no knight g3 anymore and the white king gets checkmated. That's why after knight e3, white plays knight g3, opening the rook's way to g2. After rook takes g3 check, f takes g. Now there is no checkmate on g2 as the rook controls this square. So white is up 2 exchanges, but his position is lost because his rooks aren't doing anything and his queen is still out of play, while black queen and knight are very strong, very active, and they coordinate very well, creating constant checkmating threats to the white king. The white king is in trouble. So queen b1 check follows. What to do now? If the king moves to h2, then knight takes g4 check. Now, if king h3, then of course the h1 rook falls, and that leads to checkmate. And if the king moves to g2, then queen e4 check. The king must retreat to g1 to defend the h1 rook, and that would be followed by queen e1, however. So another rook falls in this case. After king g2, queen takes d2 check, and knight e3, black creates two checkmating threats on g2 and on g4. That's why after queen b1 check, the king moves to, in our actual game, the king moves to f2, leaving the rook unguarded, but of course attacking the knight. So, of course, Rubinstein captures on g4 with a check. Now, if the king moves to g2, that would lead to the same variation I have just shown you after queen e4 check. That's why the king moves to e2 instead. Of course, Rubinstein didn't capture the rook. In this case, white could have got some time to defend. That's why to capture the rook when you can capture it with a check, with a tempo. So, first Rubinstein plays queen e4, check, and also attacking the rook, forcing the white king to move to the first rank. And in this position, Marshall actually resigned, because in case the king and the king must move to the first rank, so after it moves to d1, for example, queen takes h1 check. Now, if the king moves to c2, then checkmate in 1. And if the king moves to e2, black would force the white king to move to c2 by playing queen g2 check, queen g1 check, queen f2 check, queen f1 check, and then again checkmate would follow. So in this position, Marshall resigned. And now I recommend watching another game by Rubinstein, in which he carries out one of his greatest pawn storms. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.